Hi everybody, I'm Mark Andrews. Welcome. I think we've got technical difficulties solved and we're ready to get started. Most of you are birders. Most of you spend a lot of time outdoors and deal with complications all the time. So thanks very much for your patience. This is the last event of the first Sea Islands Shorebird Festival, and we're really happy to have all of you here. I hope that you had a chance to get out on the beach and see some of the red knots and other shorebirds that we have here, and I hope you got over to Feather Fest today. There were just great artists and photographers, authors, kids' activities. It was well done. I want to say thank you to Don Wyndham and the Kilo Conservancy for the great production they put on last night. It was just a super affair. Felicia Sanders' research and inspiration is the reason why many of us are here tonight. Ben Clark's film was beautifully done. Dave Watkins did a great study on red knot reciting, and Abby Sterling did a masterful job of emceeing that, keeping it, interweaving all the ideas and the highlights of the red knot story. I'm up here because I'm one of the leaders of the Shorebird Steward Program. I'm also the guy that founded it 5 years ago. My co-leaders are Bob Mercer, who is in Pennsylvania chasing warblers, and Leslie Moore, who does the day-to-day activities for the stewards. Leslie organized tonight's event and served our bubbly. Thanks, Leslie. I also want to say thanks to all the Seabrook Shorebird stewards who just this year have already talked with hundreds of people on the beach. The last 2 years we've talked with 1,500 people. 70% of those people are visitors, and it shows just how valuable having a steward on the beach is. We have a tough time reaching visitors. We have lots of media that reaches residents, but it's really hard to get in touch with visitors. But having people on the beach with a sign and just a smile brings people over, and they learn about shorebirds. Most of the folks are here to see dolphins and turtles, but people are learning about shorebirds, and that's very gratifying. The stewards are also responsible for a lot of the little and big details that made this festival work. So thank you for all the shorebird stewards that are in the audience tonight. Our host tonight is Seabrook Island Birders. Walter Brooks is here, he's the president. There are a number of people who are Seabrook Island Birders here. Seabrook Island Birders was a really small bird club just a few years ago. It's now 300 members. It's built an incredible organization. They have a communications and team, a website, and once you join Seabrook Island Birders, the first thing they ask you is, can you write, can you take pictures, because they expect something on the blog. But that effort has really meant that there's an awareness of birds now on this island. It's just incredible. And it's not just shorebirds, it's tree birds and everything. But the Seabrook Island Birders is really responsible for that. And as a parent organization to us, the Shorebird Steward team, it's just a perfect natural home. So thank you very much. to Walter, and thank you to Judy Moore and Gina Sanders, Nancy Brown for all the assistance in getting the word out about the festival. I also have to say something about two very special people from Seabrook Birders. They are Ed and Aya Conrad. I is the consummate birder and the writer of the team. Ed is the photographer, graphic designer, and counselor to our program. And they've been very instrumental, even before the Shorebird Steward program, in bringing shorebirds to life for people on the island. Another thank you is to Mayor John Gregg of the town of Seabrook, who proclaimed this week as Shorebird Celebration Week on Seabrook. That's just phenomenal. Our steward program's close friend is Councilwoman Jerry Finke. Jerry has just been instrumental in promoting conservation causes on the island, and she was key to the development of the beach ordinance for pets, which keeps dogs away from the most crucial shorebird habitat on the beach. It's just a remarkable change, to see how well accepted that ordinance is and how few dogs we have in those special places. I have to say, I've spent, all of us who organized this, have spent the last 10 months together working to get all this organized. And I'd like to acknowledge all those folks. The idea of the Shorebird Festival started with the persistence of Betty Papillo of Kiowa. Betty, was Aaron Gibbon, the town of Kiowa wildlife biologist. I think Aaron's here. From Kiowa Conservancy, Cammie Capt from South Carolina DNR, Melissa Chaplin from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Alyssa Zabrowski from South Carolina Audubon, Abby Sterling of Manamat, and then Allie Heiser, and of course I already told you that of Manamat, and I already told you about Mercer as a leader. So tonight our program focuses on the inlet that is the centerpiece of what has been called the Kiowa Seabrook Islands-Deveaux complex. These shorebirds are here in numbers like they are because of this area, because of whatever feature it is that draws them in. Captain Sams Inlet, for those of you who aren't from here, it's Sams without the apostrophe. Comes from Captain Robert Sams, who was a planter here on John's Island, and he died in 1760. So it's a very old name. Tonight's speakers will focus on the topography and dynamism of the inlet and why shorebirds congregate here.
Thanks, Melissa. As Melissa mentioned, we've got many species of coastal birds on our beaches, and they're here at different times of year. And what we've been learning about over the past 2 days is just how special this place along the edge of South Carolina is for bird life. So my talk is going to focus on those attributes of this area and how they relate to shorebirds. So to start things off, let's do a quiz. So how many of these, you can, to yourself, you can keep track, but how many can you identify from this figure? I've observed all of these species, either on Kiowa or Seabrook over the years. Some are here in winter, some migrate through, and some nest here in the summer. species we have here are in trouble. Their populations are declining all over the world, and these guys occur all over the hemisphere. Most of them, traveling between hemispheres every year of their life, and they face a lot of threats along their way. Of the 19 species listed here, 10 are listed as high or highest priority according to our state wildlife action plan. 3 are listed as state threatened or endangered. And these populations have shrunk over 70% across North America since 1973. And reasons for this are habitat loss, alteration, disturbance, climate change, and other threats during migration. So let's talk about what these birds need in order to survive and how seabrook and Kiowa are helping to contribute to that. Yesterday, we learned about red knots and their marathon migration from South America to above the Arctic Circle. And they stop here in spring to rest and refuel for that northern migration, and feeding is really important to shorebirds. They have, as Aaron pointed out on the Birders Breakfast, they have different sized bills depending on what they eat. And they can partition the resources and take advantage of different prey items in the sand and mud. And they also have various length legs where they can kind of take advantage of different substrates. So up in the right there's a ruddy turnstone, and this one's actually feeding on horseshoe crab eggs. They'll crab egg in its mouth. And ruddy turnstones have really super sharp bills they use to poke and dig horseshoe crab eggs. Second bird down there is a dowager. And these guys curl up and down in the mud, and they can feel insect larvae and eat that. And then godwits down here, super tall bird, really long bill, and it's kind of upturned. They use that like a shovel, so they can wade out deeper in the water and really probe down further and take advantage of those prey resources. So each species has really cool adaptations for feeding. Another component necessary for their survival is resting. Especially shorebirds that have those really long migrations. Roosting is just an ornithological term that means sleeping. And in the case of shorebirds that occur in coastal systems, that doesn't necessarily mean sleeping at night. Shorebirds sleep when they can't feed. And they can't feed when the water's too high for their little different-sized shorebird legs. So often they roost when the tide is high and when the water is covering the feeding grounds. So this is a pretty common sight to see birds find a patch of sand, sometimes at the base of the dune, sometimes in dry open spaces of the beach, flock up together and often tuck their bill in or roost on one leg, and they do that to conserve energy and reduce heat loss. So lots of time they're roosting at the very tip of islands where there's a peninsula or where they're surrounded by that high water on multiple sides. Since they go on long migration journeys, they need to feed a lot and they need to conserve that energy they just consumed. So feeding and roosting are really the main goals of shorebirds during migration. And they need to do this because they have a long way to go before they nest. Of the shorebird species that occur in North America, about half nest in the Arctic zone of the hemisphere. So ruddy turnstones, red knots, black-bellied plover, and sanderlings all nest above the Arctic Circle. Another 24% nest in the boreal region of Canada and interior Alaska. Birds like yellowlegs and dowitchers and leaf sandpipers nest there. And then the rest are found nesting here in the temperate zone. Birds like willets, oystercatchers, Wilson's clovers. So nesting season is really only about 4 to 6 weeks of the year. So they spend a month finding a mate, laying and incubating eggs, and when the chicks hatch, some of those species even leave before the young is fledged. I was telling some folks on my walk, female western sandpipers depart the breeding grounds before the young have fledged, leaving the males to tend to the chicks. So nesting really happens about a month, and fall migration starts, around July, when we think of it as the middle of summer. So, where these birds need to feed and rest so they can migrate and nest. And why are they here at Seabrook and Kiowa? The diversity of shorebird species and the magnitude, just the number of each species is really phenomenal here in this spot in South Carolina. So this all brings it back to the Captain Sams Spit Inlet area and what the special complex of islands has to offer for these birds. Looking at a little bit bigger picture, as I mentioned, Seabrook and Kiowa are part of the stretch of unique coastline just south of Charleston. There's 3 barrier islands, Botany Bay, which is just to the south of the North Edisto River, and then Seabrook and Kiowa are these 3 barrier islands, and they are kind of bookended by 2 estuarine islands, Thibault Bay and Keystone, 2 islands owned and managed by South Carolina DNR as seabird sanctuaries. So it's about 20 miles stretch of coast, and shorebirds and seabirds pop around between these spots pretty regularly. But this stretch has a lot to offer to meet their needs. So let's talk about why the coast is shaped like it is and why we have these barrier islands and also the high tidal amplitude here. I'm not a coastal geologist, so I'm going to kind of explain this how I understand it and just kind of give you the basics as they pertain to shorebirds. So, this part of the coast from Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, down to Cape Canaveral in Florida is known as the Georgia Bight, or the South Atlantic Bight. And this feature of the coastline here is that the continental shelf, or the ocean floor, is very shallow and very wide along this part of the Atlantic Ocean. So the shallow ocean floor goes way out, and that translates into higher tides than other parts of the Atlantic coast, where the ocean floor is deeper. So a shallow bottom means bigger water when the tide is coming. And then another feature of this part of the coast is the many barrier islands along the shore. South Carolina has at least 25 of them. And coastal processes make these spits of sand that are parallel to the shore. And they have breaks in between them called inlets. So the sand moves and gets deposited by waves and currents. And the coastline really runs east to west in South Carolina instead of north to south. And as wind and waves shift from weather patterns, these barrier islands move, they erode, they accrete, and the breaks within the barrier islands are these inlets. And the general definition of an inlet is where the bayside water body kind of joins up with the ocean side between two pieces of land. And inlets are very productive systems. And birds love the dynamic processes associated with inlets. As I mentioned, shorebirds roost when the tide is high and feed when the tide gets lower. And in South Carolina, we have some of the highest tides along the Atlantic coast. We have 2 high tides and 2 low tides within 24 hours. And depending on the moon cycle, the amplitude of the high and low can be different. This image is from my tide log. It's my Bible. I take it everywhere. My life is run by the tides this time of year. But you can kind of see from this image, my tide log, this is during the week of a full moon. And notice the high tides are over 6 feet, and they're higher during the evening times. And then the lows dip into the negative, so that it's below, during low tide, it's below 0. And the slope of the line is something that I want to point out too. It's very steep. So that means the water is rushing super fast during this week of the tide, moving sand in the water column. The power of the water really can move sediment and sand around during these events. So for a shorebird, when the water comes in and covers the sand and mud, it rejuvenates the prey base. All the creatures that were under the sand move around and get redistributed. The Donax clams that Felicia talked about with the red knots get redistributed by the waves. And each tide cycle, it's like going to a fresh buffet every time there's a new tide. And Kiowa and Seabrook have these shallow beaches that go out forever when the tide is low, so the spread of the buffet is immense. This photo is from a flight I did just a few weeks ago surveying for red knots. And this is the east end of Kiowa at high tide. And you can see the breaks in the sand in this image, and just these small little inlets and extensive marsh that separate the shoreline from the mainland. So the barrier islands of Seabrook and Kiowa have exactly what shorebirds need. The great foraging resources enriched by the geography and tides, and the oscillum roosting habitat at either side of the inlet of these islands. The moving sand means woody vegetation doesn't establish, and being surrounded by water means less land-based predators, which is safer for shorebirds. So don't just take my word for it. Brian Harrington is an international shorebird researcher. He worked all through the late 70s and through the 80s and 90s on shorebird projects in the U.S., as well as working with red knots in the Arctic and in South America. And he wrote Flight of the Red Knot, which was a book that was published in '96. And Brian developed a way that folks could survey and count flocks of shorebirds to help get at population numbers and trends, and came up with the International Shorebird Survey Protocol. We still use this protocol today to count birds all around the hemisphere and get at flock numbers to add to the long-term data set that Brian established. So Brian analyzed shorebird distribution and abundance from these international shorebird surveys at 361 sites in the southeastern U.S. In 2008, he published this paper, Coastal Inlets as Strategic Habitat for Shorebirds, and he found that 7 shorebird species are tied to inlets, including the piping plover, red knot, western sandpiper, and Wilson's plover. And he said shorebirds not only use but require inlets for their survival. So that underscores the importance of Captain Sams Inlet between Kiowa and Seabrook. Both Kiowa and Seabrook have these features that Brian listed in his publication. They have expansive tidal flats, rich with food that wintering and migrating shorebirds need, sandy spits that serve as roosting sites where shorebirds can rest and digest and conserve energy, and then also open and sparsely vegetated areas where beach nesting birds can raise their young. So the Sea Islands really check all these boxes that Brian noted in this publication. So that's a little bit of background about what shorebirds need, and a little bit about how the shorebirds might see the islands here at Seabrook and Kiowa. If you have any questions, go ahead and jot those down on your paper. And next we'll hear about those individual stories of some specific species and what they have to share.
Okay, so if you joined us last night, you probably already know that I'm a shorebird food collector. And I'm probably one of the only people that gets really excited about collecting it. And maybe after this talk you'll understand why. So when I was at Clemson, I took a marine invertebrate class, and I have been fascinated with them ever since, especially echinoderms. Years ago, I teamed up with benthic ecologists in the Marine Resources Division at South Carolina DNR to learn more about piping plover diet preferences. I'm currently working with Andrew Steele of DNR on several shorebird diet projects, and Janet and Mark have been fellow poop collectors and helped me with this latest effort. In case you're not that familiar with piping plovers, they are a federally threatened shorebird. There are 3 breeding populations: the northern Great Plains, all the way to the west, the Great Lakes, up here in the middle, that's now happily not only the U.S. side, but also the Canadian side. And the Atlantic coast, which also spans the U.S. And Canada. The Great Lakes population is the smallest population. There were 72 breeding pairs this past season, and that's a tremendous progress from the all-time low of 12 breeding pairs in 1990. All 3 breeding populations overlap on their wintering grounds. As you can see here, it's pretty much the southeastern U.S., the Gulf, and parts of the Caribbean. But parts of Florida. Another important point to make about piping plovers is that they have extremely high site fidelity. If they survive their first winter in a location, they will continue to winter in that location despite habitat conditions until they die. So some of you have seen banded piping plovers probably right here on Kiowa and Seabrook Islands, and we do get regular resites from both Kiowa and Seabrook, so thank you so much for reporting them. And some of you already know that piping plover banding schemes are the most complicated banding scheme in the shorebird world, and they do not follow the international flag colors. Most banders have switched to engraved alphanumeric flags, but some projects on the Atlantic coast and still exclusively with the Great Lakes, they still use the colored band. But I'll give you this tip. If you see a banded piping plover with an orange flag, and what I mean by that is just that little tab sticking off of the band, you can bet that it's from the Great Lakes population. Other combinations, because Great Lakes, they use what's known as brood markers, may take a little bit more investigation if you're not that familiar. But don't get too frustrated. Everyone's always very happy to help you figure it out. And pictures are also definitely help. So Janet has already touched on the inlets in South Carolina. But what we have noticed over the years is that the largest local wintering populations tend to occur south of Charleston. And I really think this is likely due to the number of high inlets and sounds in that part of our coast. And just to give you an idea of what a high number for a wintering population would be here, would be 20 to 30 piping plovers. We're not Texas that gets hundreds at a site. 20 to 30 is a good site for us. And birds are primarily from either the Atlantic coast or the Great Lakes population. Chances are, if you're seeing an unbanded piping plover, it's probably from the Atlantic coast. We know from band resites that piping plovers use inlet complexes, and wintering birds stay close to the ends of the islands. So what I want you to notice here, though, is that notice this movement not only between Captain Sams Inlet with Seabrook and Kiowa, but also between Deveaux. We did not think that these birds, especially ones wintering on Deveaux, would have a reason to leave unless extreme tides could push them off. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. But also during migration, particularly spring migration, you can find piping plovers along the length of Kiowa. We do not currently know what the passage population is. In other words, how many birds are using Kiowa over the entire span of migration. But Aaron Gibbon has had really high daily counts, up in the 80s when he's done surveys. Janet already mentioned the shorebird tide connection, but I just wanted to point out, because it definitely is key for piping plovers, that while the foraging areas are covered, that's when they're resting, and then as soon as they start to uncover, that's when they're going to start feeding. And plovers are definitely following that same pattern. So I know Aaron already touched on this at the Birders Breakfast if you were there, and Janet just mentioned it a moment ago. But there are kind of two main strategies, probing shorebirds and gleaning shorebirds. And probing shorebirds do kind of what I refer to as the sewing machine method, where they're kind of going along and they're just like constantly pushing down and feeling with their bill for food, whereas gleaners are using their eyesight to find the food. And piping plovers are definitely gleaners. Notice their really large eyes relative to the size of their head. And also notice the really short bill. So obviously if it sticks that down in the sand, it's not going to get really far. Plovers also prefer to do what I sometimes call like the tap dance, or just the foot tapping. You may have seen that. If you've ever watched them do it, it's just kind of like they're kind of padding along, feeling for something. But if you really paid attention when they're doing that, you'll notice that wherever they're tapping, that's not where they go and pick something out. They're doing that, I think, potentially to kind of displace the water. If you've ever noticed if it's super saturated sand and you step on it, kind of like bubbles up. I think they're doing that, and then something will move, and then they key in on that, and then they'll reach right over there and grab it. So it's pretty entertaining to watch them when they're really doing that. Some do it more than others. I'm not really sure why. This is a cross-section of the sand showing the different layers and which invertebrates typically are found in each layer. It's a little confusing because it's all stacked in a column, so I find it a little bit easier if you're kind of looking at it along more of a slope. But the lower that you get in the intertidal zone, closer to the low water line, the more invertebrate diversity that you have. So years ago, a graduate student, Kate and I, collected plover fecal samples. And at the time, the DNR Mythic Lab was identifying the species by the pieces and parts that remained in the fecal samples. And that's also how they determined kind of what they put out as the preferred prey item list, is basically something that they knew that the bird had consumed. But recently, we've used DNA analysis to determine diet to make sure that we were capturing the soft-bodied organisms that may not be well represented in those samples for taxonomic identification. So I interrupt this talk to just mention that we are currently doing a project also on red knot diet. And we sampled marsh relics and collected fecal samples from knots while they were foraging out there on the relics. These were from Bull's Island, which is part of the Cape Remain National Wildlife Refuge. And we've been doing this for other habitats they're using as well. I even collected some out on Kiowa at the inlet the other day. But back to piping plovers. So what are they eating here in South Carolina? They do eat a lot of amphipods, and there are 3 dominant species. There's little crustacean, little shrimp-like things that are down in the sand. They love polychaete worms, and they are predominantly eating 2 dominant species there. But something really cool is that they're eating Meneridian worms, and specifically this one species, the milky ribbon worm, and that was discovered through DNA. And I often wondered when I was watching plovers pull worms out of the sand, sometimes it would be this huge, fat, pink thing, and I'm thinking, what is that? And especially if the black-bellied plover or anybody else saw them going for that, they were coming to try to get it. But you can see these, and that's what they have been getting, but because they're so soft-bodied, there's not really much left in the poop after it's been through the gut. And they do also eat insects too. That's more known on the breeding grounds, but they do eat them here, especially when they're on the rack or kind of buzzing around the rack after things have started to decay. So a few of the characteristics that have really come to light is just reiterating, their prey preferences, mainly the polychaete worms, but they do definitely go for amphipods as well. But also abundance is key. And some of these places that are the hot spots where we have sampled, the density in the samples that we've collected has been really, really high and amazing. And just also, if you look up here, the size, it might be a little too small, but it's kind of showing you after these have been staying with the rose Bengal stain, just so it's easier to pick them out when you're sorting through the samples. Same here for the polychaete worms. And just notice that the polychaetes are about 3 times the size and weight of the amphipods. So that tells you that they're just, you get a lot more bang for your buck if you're eating those. Also, elevation is a key thing. This is a picture of the perched isolated depression. There have been multiple on Seabrook Island. This is a bit of an old picture. But what's so important about this is that it means that it's available for them to feed at any stage of the tide. And then also the substrate. The finer substrates support more diversity and especially a lot more polychaetes. So we've already kind of started to talk about the importance of inlets, and this is just reiterating that. And what I'm highlighting here in this graphic are these shoals or sandbars that are in the basically the inlet mouth that eventually can either stay subtidal or build up and migrate onshore to create more habitat. This is an example of two other inlets further south in our state. Price Inlet is north. It's between Bulls Island and Capers Island, and then Trenchers Inlet is in the southern part of our state. That is Bay Point down there. And you can see that these shoals are moving ashore and welding on. And what's also really amazing is that now we've started to look at this a little bit closer. These areas tend to become the plover hotspots, and we get the higher local winter populations while these habitat conditions are present. So this is just a little snapshot. It's just a quick thing. Just going to play it here. It's going to go really fast, but it's going to show you just kind of how the shoals could change. How Deveaux Bank, you can see the bar right here off of the North Edisto. Basically, you'll just be able to see how that, and then you can notice some of the changes going on at the Captain Sams as well. It's just illustrating just how our shorelines are just constantly changing. So, here are two aerial photos of Deveaux Bank. These are from different time periods. And before I tell you which time periods they're from, I just want you to look at this little basic legend that is a simplified, it's based on something that we just recently put out on foraging habitat for piping Clovers. But what you see here is just a simple key that is just kind of giving it a star rating of the most important habitats. And you'll see here that those semi-isolated and isolated depressions, again, those ones that are available at all stages of the tide, are the most valuable. So note that the presence of the two semi-isolated depressions here back in 2005 and 2006, you can see two of them have formed here. And at that time, Deveaux had, and this was at a minimum of 20 piping Clovers wintering there. And then notice over on the 2018-2019 season, we're only seeing about 3 piping Clovers that were wintering there. And you can notice how the habitat conditions really diminished. Those isolated depressions are no longer there, and it's pretty much strictly intertidal or sand flats. There are a little bit of shelter flats back in here. But we also think that this is why we started seeing a lot more movement between Clovers that were using Captain Sams Inlet. That they were coming back and forth to Deveaux because of these changes in habitat conditions. So, this diagram illustrates how habitats and their availability influence the shorebird's energy expenditure. But in this case, I'm just going to walk you through this based on piping Clovers. And we've been talking a lot about inlets, and they do create a mosaic of habitats that are constantly changing. what prey resources are available. And piping plovers mainly overlap with other piping plovers, sanderlings, and semi-palmated plovers when they're feeding. Those are kind of their nearest neighbors. And they do actually form foraging territories, and they will actively defend them. They show most aggression towards other piping plovers, and they come out of nowhere to kick out another piping plover that's moved into their territory. And that's actually often how we catch them. But they also will do the same with semi-palmated plovers. Distance to their roost is also another factor. The highest quality habitats are going to have roosting and foraging habitats really close together. And we've already talked a lot about inundation time, but it's another important factor because, again, the longer the foraging habitat is available, the easier it is for the birds to recoup excess energy expenditure. And this is where disturbance comes in. When birds are disturbed from normal activities like foraging and resting, it takes a lot more of a toll, and if they are using lower quality habitats, because they're not going to have as much time or as many resources to recoup this excess energy expenditure. So some of you may be aware of this work, but in 2018, colleagues with the Virginia Tech Shorebird program, we published the results of our study that happened across multiple sites in Georgia and South Carolina, including KSI-Deveaux, that linked disturbance to survival, which was a first in shorebirds and especially for piping plovers. This also is a plover near and dear to my heart. This is black-white. This was the first plover that I ever banded. He's no longer with us, but he ended up being from the Atlantic Coast population, and he nested at Rockaway Beach near Queens in New York and wintered on Harbor Island. So our study found that their survival and the local population growth were lower in more disturbed areas than in less disturbed areas. And that this variation was primarily associated with where they were spending their winter, which if you think about it, that's where they're spending the majority of their time. And an interesting finding was that the birds in the more disturbed sites were 7% lighter than birds that were using less disturbed sites. And this first result that I already mentioned blew an old assumption out of the water and showed us that survey numbers do not necessarily reflect what's going on in the local population. Although survey numbers suggested that local wintering populations looked stable, the banding study showed that these were not the same individuals. New recruits were not increasing the local wintering populations because they were replacing the dead birds. And if you're not aware, the average lifespan of piping plovers is about 5 years, so they're a shorter lived shorebird compared to other species. So it's a bit bold, but kind of the take-home message from our study was that if we didn't see a bird that was wintering at one of these more disturbed sites, it died, it didn't move somewhere else. And the way we were able to vet that was that these birds that we were banded, they never turned up anywhere else. They never turned up back on the breeding grounds, and they never turned up in another site. So chronic disturbance can be a real problem, and it really can interfere with the shorebird's normal behavior, and can actually lower habitat that's good quality, but it can lower it because it prevents the birds from accessing available resources and causes excess energy expenditure. High quality habitats with high levels of disturbance may actually mask the effects of disturbance while those habitat conditions are good. And this is something that we're looking into. This is because because the birds are not going to be able to offset that additional expenditure if they have access, if they have access to habitats that provide food during all stages, like those perch depressions that I was mentioning, that can potentially offset that. But once those features go away, then it's not going to be able to offset those effects. So kind of the last thing that we just started some of this field work this past winter, again working with colleagues with the Virginia Tech Shorebird program, and we're exploring the physiological effect of disturbance. This is being done by looking at telomere length, which is the end caps of chromosomes. If you're a little bit rusty on that, I know I was when we first started talking about this. But they actually shorten with age. And there's actually been a lot of work done on this on humans, but also now with wildlife, and particularly in birds, that illustrates the role that oxidative stress not only plays on us as humans, but also on wildlife as well through this telomere shortening. So that's what we're looking at with piping plover. So we're going to see how the telomere lengths compare between the birds wintering at lower disturbance sites versus higher disturbance sites. Another thing, since we only had a year for this work instead of 5 years like the past study, we were also looking at surrogates and so other shorebirds that share wintering areas to increase sample size. And I can say that, interestingly, but possibly sadly, the preliminary work is showing that the signals are the same in all of these species that are sharing wintering areas. So one of the main things that we're trying to figure out is how the oxidative stress is influencing body condition and possibly their lifespan. But I don't want to end on that. I want to end on some of the phenomenal things that are happening in our state, including stewardship. Because stewardship is essential. It's throughout the entire life cycle. We used to focus more on nesting, but really, I truly believe that it's really a full life cycle. Winter, migration, and breeding. We need stewards out there. So it's really important because it limits because it's able to limit disturbance. And I want to say that we have an amazing group of partners that are working on the shorebirds in this state, and the new stewards that I meet and talk with every single day just blow me away. And it's really inspiring, and it gives me a lot of hope. I'm going to get a little choked up here. So I just want to say thank you very much, because I know it can be very challenging, but it's really important, and especially in terms of piping plovers for your high tide roosts and also foraging features, can make a really big difference. So to all of you who are shorebird stewards, thank you so much. And also, if you're thinking about becoming a shorebird steward, please do. So I know we're kind of leaving questions until the end, if you have any. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Abby.
Well, we are moving through the seasons of shorebirds, and now we're going to talk a little bit about our nesting species that we have here in the spring and summer. And so, of course, we're going to talk about American oystercatchers, which I think are one of the coolest shorebirds. I am biased, but today I'm just going to talk a little bit about oystercatchers, nesting, and some of the conservation issues that they face as well. And so I know I'm talking to, I guess, singing to the choir, preaching to the choir. We know that the beach is much more than just a sandbox next to a swimming pool, right? But unfortunately, some people don't know that. So we are lucky enough to understand the beach as much more, and we know that it is really valuable habitat for a variety of species. And many of the species that rely on the beach, these shorebirds that are traveling huge distances, but even thinking smaller, the invertebrates that Melissa was just talking about, all of these organisms that depend on our beach habitats are really adapted to living in an environment that's difficult, as well as fragile and beautiful. And so that really is true for our beach nesting shorebirds, like American oystercatchers. I think a lot of people come from the Southeast and get really excited about sea turtles nesting. How many of y'all care about sea turtles nesting? Pretty much everybody cares about sea turtles. But our shorebirds, our beach nesting birds, have it much more difficult than our sea turtles. They are not being able to lay their eggs. Their eggs sit right out on the open sand. And so our beach nesting birds create a little depression in the sand. They lay their eggs right on the sand. And their main mechanism for defense is blending in, right? Which works really well when you're trying to avoid fish rows or raccoons maybe. But can be really problematic when there are a lot of people on the beach. They don't build up a bunch of sticks around the nest. They don't really often even decorate the nest at all. They want those eggs to blend in perfectly. And the eggs really are designed to blend in perfectly. So we're talking about American oystercatchers. They incubate their eggs over the course of about 28 days or so. And when we think about incubation for shorebirds, they're not sitting on those eggs to keep them cool, but to keep them warm, right? Because they're out in the summer. They actually are shading them, keeping them cool. Wilson's Clovers, in fact, will do a really cool behavior where they'll go down and soak their belly feathers in the ocean when it gets really, really hot, and then go over those eggs to keep them cool. So it's really important for the parents, both the males and the females, to incubate these eggs, to protect those eggs and keep them safe, both from overfeeding and from predators. And if everything goes according to plan, in about a month or so, their eggs will hatch. Now, our shorebirds that nest along the South Carolina and Georgia coast here in the southeast, they usually have a few tries, right? So if something goes wrong, if there's tidal overwash or if the nest gets taken out by predators, they will try again. And they'll usually try up to about 3 times in the course of the season. But the goal is to get chicks hatched out on the beach. So here's an American oystercatcher chick. Oystercatcher chicks, Wilson's Clover chicks, many of our shorebirds have precocial chicks, which basically means they're cute, right? They're like a little chick or a little duckling compared to, say, a robin or a cardinal, which is a little less cute thing. And so these oystercatchers will actually leave those little scrapes in the sand, their nest site, after they hatch. And oystercatchers are really lucky, their parents will feed them. And so they leave that nest site and they move around on the beach. Often when they're really small, they hide in wrack or vegetation. And again, you'll notice that egg was really cryptic, right? But this oystercatcher chick is also super cryptic. That coloring on its back, the color of its little fuzzy down, it blends in really, really well with its surroundings. And it can be very difficult to see these guys. But oystercatchers grow up very closely with their parents. They kind of move around on the beach as a family, and as they get bigger, you'll start to see them more and more. And oystercatcher chicks, unlike some of our other shorebird chicks, actually get fed by their parents. So another very cool behavior that you can see during the nesting season, if you keep your eyes open, is you'll see the adults flying in with different food items. And of course, oystercatchers eat oysters. And other mollusks and bivalves and things like that. So very often you can watch the parents fly in with a big hunk of something delicious, call to the chick will run out from the vegetation, they'll feed them, and then the chick will go off and hide again. As they get bigger, they get bolder, and it's more and more likely that you're able to see these guys. And so it can take them anywhere up to about 40 days before they can fly. It really depends on the amount of food and the amount of disturbance they're facing. But they are pretty much adult-sized when they can fly. And very often, both here in South Carolina and in Georgia, right before these chicks fly, we try to ban them. And so that helps us identify the individuals and learn about where they're going, learn about how they disperse after they fly and fledge, and then if they come back, we can track them over the course of their lifetime. Oystercatchers are a really cool, long-lived species. They can live, European oystercatchers can live 40 years. So you can get attached to an oystercatcher and it'll sit around, hopefully. And so right now, this time of year, they're nesting on our beaches, they're nesting on, particularly in our inlets, They're nesting on some of the higher sandbars. They're also nesting on shell breaks along the edges of marshes. So, whether you're here on Gila and Seabrook or exploring the coast more broadly, it's always a really good thing to sort of keep in mind that if you see adult oystercatchers, as they're calling, they very likely have chicks or nests. And so it's really important at this time of year to give them plenty of space. So this is a photo of an oystercatcher and a chick in Georgia on a shell break. I couldn't talk about oystercatchers to you all without talking about your most famous, most beloved oystercatcher. How many people know U5? Yeah, that's awesome. So I was very excited when I was looking up this history of U5 because U5 was banded in 2008 on Little St. Simon's Island in Georgia. And that was my first winter on Little St. Simon's Island. I came to the Georgia coast actually to study sea turtles and then fell in love with shorebirds. And then I got to go out with the Georgia DNR biologists that were doing this big banding effort and got to hold for the first time the American oystercatcher, which was maybe my first experience, definitely my first experience, holding a shorebird, which led to this whole crazy journey where I am now doing shorebird research and conservation. So that's a big thank you to U5. But I think it's really cool because it totally connects me to everybody here on Seabrook. So U5 was banded in 2008 on Little St. Simon's in the winter as an adult. And it spent a lot of time after banding sort of bouncing around between Georgia and South Carolina, which is really interesting. We know all of this because so many people recite oystercatchers. They report those observations to the Oystercatcher Working Group banding database. And you can go right in, you can search this bird's history, and you can see every single observation of U5 and where it's been. Super cool. And it's quite the rabbit hole, but you can kind of concoct a little clever story about what U5 has been up to. Eventually, U5 made it up to Captain Sams Inlet around 2016, where it sort of became established for the long term. And now it's pretty much year-round here at Captain Sams. It did have, I think, the first fledgling attempt that was in the database was in 2013 on Kiowa, but you all in this room may know much more of the story than I do. Just 2 years ago, 2021, I'm sure you all know, U5 successfully had chicks. He and his mate raised and fledged 2 chicks, and Janet came out and banded those guys. So they got these blue bands with the codes CY and DZ, and they don't have any reports in the database yet, but keep your eyes open. Hopefully they're around. The first year of life for any shorebird is pretty touch and go, but hopefully these guys made it and they will reappear, and we will get to see them and follow them on their journeys. Can't talk about oystercatchers without broadening the scope a little bit and just mentioning a few of the other beach nesting birds. So I like this picture because the oystercatchers in focus and then our poor forgotten Wilson Clovers. So we've got a couple different species of other shorebirds that nest on our beaches. Wilson's Clovers nest on the beaches as well. Very similar to oystercatchers, a little scrape in the sand. Here's a chick, an egg, another little chick, and a female back here hiding. We also have willets that nest on the beaches and killdeer as well. And then we have seabirds that nest on our beaches. Shorebirds nest in territories, single territories across the beach. Many of our seabirds are colonial nesters, and they nest in large groups. So we have least terns and black skimmers. Least terns are really cute. The smallest terns sound like little squeaky toys, but they are tough. Don't let them fool you. If they set up a colony, you know it, and hopefully, you get to see adorable little tern chicks eventually. Disturbance really is one of the biggest threats for our beach nesting birds. We just heard a lot about how disturbance is impacting our wintering birds, but of course for birds that are nesting on the beaches, it can be really problematic. For many of these species like oystercatchers, when they feel threatened, they will actually just get up and sneak away, run off the nest and leave it. And that leaves it vulnerable to overheating and predators. So it's really important to give these birds space during the nesting season. I think one really good rule of thumb is staying on the wet sand. These birds actually will nest in a pretty wide diversity of places. So generally speaking, if you're on the wet sand, you know you're not going to be observing front beach nesting birds. And the same holds true when you're exploring the coast more broadly. Yeah, so this is basically reasons that you want to give these birds space. This photo I really like. It's a little Wilson's plover nest, and you can see there's an outline here of a Wilson's plover. And it was raining, and this was during my PhD research, so I was actually actively monitoring the nests. And I wasn't monitoring it when it was raining, of course, because they didn't want to scare these birds off of their eggs. They were keeping them safe from the rain. But then you can see all the raindrops around where the plover was. So it's really important because when they feel threatened, they will leave those nests. And then the other big issue is, of course, if you're anywhere above the tide line, the eggs and the chicks are really protected. When the chicks feel threatened, they run and hide, and they hide really well, and they blend in really well. So even little clumps of grass or vegetation on the beach can become a perfect plover hiding place, and can be really easy to accidentally crash them. So this is me kind of battered by this projector. Try to find that plover chick. It's pretty tricky. He's hiding right here in the raft, and you see it blends in perfectly. Little tiny, little oddball toothpicks. So as we touched on and continue to touch on, stewardship really does make a difference. You know, we can post signs, we can try to talk to people off the beach, but really when somebody on the beach encounters stewards, it is super meaningful. And steward during the breeding season, you've got the opportunity to potentially show people a tiny little adorable chick running around, which is the most guaranteed way to change someone's behavior. Once they see how cute those chicks are, it's a pretty easy sell to try to convince them that the birds need space. There are a lot of things that we can all do to help our nesting shorebirds. Obviously, giving them space, staying on the wet skin, but I think most importantly, and this is exactly what you all do, I think being invested is share stories. Learn about what's going on, whether you're formally in the stewardship program here or on Kilo, or you just are interested in telling people. I'm going to see what is on the beach in front of them year-round, but during nesting season, really can make a difference for our shorebirds. And so, with that, I'm going to wrap up talking about oystercatchers. I could talk about them all night, but we'll save that for later. If you have questions, please put them down on the cards. We'd love to answer them, and I'm going to turn it over to Maina.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Well, thank you so much to all of the organizers of this great two-day festival for a chance to be part of this Birds of the Inlet event. As Melissa mentioned, my name is Maina. I'm a PhD student in the Environmental Conservation Department at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I'm one of the luckiest people on the planet because I get to work with the incredible coastal birds team at South Carolina DNR for my PhD research about Whimbrel, which is what I'm going to share with you about tonight. So thanks to Janet and Melissa and Abby and Felicia and Ben last night, we heard a lot at this festival about how critical the South Carolina coast is for many shorebird species. But what I want to do tonight is, for this last talk, just zoom in a little bit and think about how, considering the habitat needs and stopover behaviors of individual migratory birds, can actually be a lens to help us develop conservation action that can help benefit these species as a whole. Because we know that whether breeding or feeding, shorebirds often return to the same sites over and over again. As we heard tonight, this is something called site fidelity. And birds do this because returning to the same location every year comes with a lot of benefits, right? When you become familiar with a place, you know where the food is, you know where the predators hide, and it helps these birds save a lot of costs that they might otherwise face if they were constantly searching for new habitat, assessing its quality, having to frequently switch between locations. And these energy savings really add up when you are a long-distance migratory shorebird that only has a short amount of time to refuel on your epic migration. But what happens when the sites these birds have come to count on stop being the same year after year? Now, this might seem to us impossible to imagine happening in South Carolina, but the reality is we are living in a rapidly changing world. And these birds might start to return to these places they have come to know and find them very different than the last time they were here. So what this means for shorebirds is that site fidelity is only a good strategy if the food resources, the conditions they've come to count on, remain consistent and predictable over time. And unfortunately, this is something that maybe is becoming less and less reliable in these times of rapid environmental change. And if these birds aren't able to flexibly adjust their behaviors in response to these changes, returning to the same site and only the same site might suddenly become a disadvantageous strategy instead of an advantageous one. So the program I'm trying to share with you tonight is our team's efforts to explore these questions in the Atlantic coast population of Whimbrels. Whimbrels are part of a group of shorebirds called Roost that sadly have been declining quite drastically in the last couple of decades. You can recognize these incredible birds by their downward curving bill that they use to probe into the mud for timber crabs and other crustaceans. Now, the Whimbrels that we have here in South Carolina are actually only here for a short time. They're stopping here en route from their non-breeding grounds in northeastern South America on their way all the way to breeding grounds across the Canadian Arctic. And we've known for a long time, thanks to the previous Whimbrel tracking studies, that the South Carolina and Georgia coasts are one of the most important northbound stopover areas for this entire population of Whimbrels. And now, with recent advances in animal movement tracking technology, we are able to try to pinpoint exactly how they're using this region so we can try to protect the parts of this place that are most important to these birds. A major clue came a few years ago when village standards, who we all know is right here with us in the room tonight, discovered a jaw-dropping number of Whimbrels roosting on one tiny island. An island that you can see from the beach right here on Sea Road. This is an island that by now many of you likely know and love. It's the constantly changing 200-ish acre sandbar called Thibault Bank. If any of you are less familiar with Thibault, from where we're sitting tonight, as Whimbrel flies anyway, it's just about 5 kilometers from here. And it sits at the mouth of the North Esco River between Sea Road and Botany Island. So with surveys that we conducted in 2019 and 2020, our team documented that the Thibault Bank hosts nearly half of the entire Atlantic flyway population, making it the largest known nocturnal rooster of species in the world. And this discovery really opened up a unique opportunity to try to better understand the role these nocturnal roosts play in the stopover ecology of Whimbrels more broadly. So we now knew that almost 20,000 Whimbrels were spending the night on this one small island. But the question quickly became, where were they all going during the day? So we've been trying hard to answer this question by tracking Whimbrels that spend the night on Thibault Bank with solar-powered GPS transmitters. Now, the way these tags work is they automatically transmit data to these 2 towers you may have seen that we install on the island every spring and fall migration. The way these towers work is that they have a small computer and battery at the base of the tower, and these towers are constantly scanning for signals from our tag birds. And if they detect our tag bird within range, it automatically downloads data off of that tag, and that helps us reduce disturbance to the birds and to the roost at night, because we can just go back during the day when the Whimbrels aren't there and collect any data that the towers were able to download without us the night before. So we program these tags to take GPS positions every 10 minutes, giving us more than 100 positions per day for each of these birds. And these points are accurate within 10 meters. So it gives us an incredibly detailed picture of the types of habitats these birds are using to forage during the day, and how they're getting to and from the building, and how far they're commuting from the nocturnal roost to get there. Just a few weeks ago, we got to tag the final birds of this study, bringing our total to 31 individuals. Those birds are actually probably arriving to go for the night as we speak. Because we've just been tracking those individuals for a couple weeks, what I'm going to share with you tonight are results from the 23 individuals that we were tracking in 2021 and 2022. major things that we've discovered is that although these birds concentrate in vast numbers at night, they don't flock together during the day. So an individual general is probably in South Carolina for about a month, and what I'm about to show you is just a 2-week snapshot of their movements during that time. So if we watch closely, we can see that all of these birds are spending the night on Thibault Bank. But during the day, they're spreading out across 60 kilometers of the South Carolina coast. And if we look even more closely, we can see that it looks like each individual is returning to the same foraging territory each day. So with this discovery, we wanted to try to dig into this question more and try to understand how precisely are individuals going back to the same site? Are they really being as faithful as it looks to these same individual territories? So one way that we can measure site fidelity is by measuring something called home range overlap. So a home range is just the area that an animal visits on a regular basis. So in this case, we're interested in the daytime foraging home ranges, or in other words, the territories that birds go to eat during the day before they go back to the Thibault Bank at night. And essentially what a home range does is it just draws an outline around the area on the map that the bird is most likely to use, and it does that based on all of the movement data that we've collected for each individual. And the way that we can then look at site fidelity is by then comparing these home ranges to each other. So for example, we can say, how similar is today's home range to the home range the bird used yesterday? Or if a bird returns in future years, we can say, well, how similar is this year's home range to the home range it used last year? Now, the metric we use to measure home range overlap is something called dotted affinity score. Don't worry, you don't have to know a thing about this metric, except that it ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 means no overlap and 1 essentially means perfect overlap. So let's say you're normal, you go to this territory one day, but tomorrow you go to this territory, your overlap score will be 0 between those 2 days. But if you go to this site today and tomorrow you go right after that site, your overlap score will be 1, okay? So here we go. What you're looking at on this map is the day-to-day foraging home ranges of these 23 individuals. Now, each color represents a different individual, and each polygon is just one day's territory stacked on top of each other. And these polygons are actually translucent. So the more opaque the color, the more that bird went back to the same exact site every single day of their month in South Carolina. Now, to visualize this in a slightly different way, this time we're going to look at those same day-to-day foraging home ranges, but this time we're going to look at them over time. So the lighter colors will be earlier in the stopover season, the darker colors will be later in the stopover season. And essentially what we did is we calculated that overlap score for every consecutive pair of days, and then we averaged that so that for each bird we had one number that basically tells us, okay, on average, how much did this bird go back to the same territory every day? Okay, well, the answer is a lot. So for reference, here's Thibault Bank in each panel, and I know it might be a tad hard to see on this screen, but you can see just from the maps how each bird went back to the same territory over the course of the whole stopover season. And even if it's a little bit hard to see, I can tell you that the majority of birds had overlap scores over 75%. Okay, how about fidelity to the Thibault Bank nocturnal roost? Here you're looking at a map of the nocturnal home ranges this time. And you can see that out of the vast expanse of salt marsh these birds utilize during the day, at night, they are all packed on Thibault. So one way that we can start to assess the potential costs and benefits of this extreme site fidelity is to look at whether the fidelity that we see within a stopover season continues between seasons and between years. So what you're going to see next is this time instead of daily foraging home ranges, we're going to look at the whole season home range for 9 individuals that we've now been able to track for at least 2 seasons. And what you're going to see now is spring migration home ranges are in yellow and purple are in fall, okay? So first up, we have the one bird that we tagged, just tracked it for 10 days as a desperate pilot effort in August 2020. We all remember that year. And this was the only bird we tagged that year. But when we go to the next season, this bird came back in the spring of 2021. And we can see that it went back to the exact same site that it used the first 10 days we tracked it. But then it also used this larger area that it very well might have been using the entire time, but when we only tracked it for a handful of days of that first season, we just didn't how incredible this site fidelity is with that overlap metric. And I'll point out that the two birds that have slightly overlapped, lower overlap scores, is just because the first season we tracked it, we were only able to follow it for 3 to 10 days, and we just weren't able to get that complete enough picture of their full routine. But then when they came back the following year, the following season, we were able to see their full month, and they went back to the exact same spot, and just used a larger area than we had realized at the beginning. So across the board, we're seeing unbelievably high site fidelity to the same foraging territories year after year. Okay, so why is it important to study site fidelity at migratory stopwatch sites? First of all, even though it wasn't necessarily a surprise to us that these birds were faithful to South Carolina as a region, to our knowledge, this level of specific individual fidelity to small-scale foraging sites, this is the first time that that's been shown at the level of a migratory stopwatch. And this really reminds us how critical it is to couple both roosting and foraging sites into our definition even of what a stopwatch is when we think about the habitat that these birds need. And it reminds us too that conservation planning efforts have to consider that these birds might have really different habitat needs during the day versus at night, and they might be extra vulnerable to any changes in those habitats because they're so faithful to the exact same sites over time. So a few days ago, we were ecstatic when 5 more of our birds returned to South Carolina from South America. To get here, they flew non-stop for 4 or 5 days, 3,000 or 3,500 miles from Brazil and Venezuela and Suriname and Guyana, and they went over open ocean flying non-stop that entire time. Where do you think the first place they landed was? Devoux. So this coast is not only incredibly important and special to us, but it is a critical link in the chain of sites that these birds count on year after year. So if you're curious to learn more, here are some QR codes you can take a photo of, basically the Oystercatchers paper that we published documenting our discovery of the Whimbrel nocturnal roost. And if you haven't seen it yet, the amazing short film made by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology about the discovery of the roost. So with that, I would just like to say thank you so much to all of the partners and funders that have supported this work, but especially to the extraordinary team at the Coastal Birds Program at SCDNR, who not only have supported me in this project in countless ways, but are working tirelessly to study and protect these birds every day. So with that, I hope you'll ask some questions to the cars so we can start a fun conversation. Thank you so much. do these local foraging observations to help us quantify how successful the whales are at finding food in these different habitats at different distances from the developing nocturnal roost. So ask again and maybe I don't know, tell you what we want.
Just ask her about next year. Thank you, Maina. All right, this next one is from Melissa. So you talked about the importance of site fidelity. You also talked about the importance of habitat. And so this next question is wondering the comparison between the two. So let's say the Captain Sams would come back to winter over here in South Carolina, and its favorite tidal pool is gone. How strong is that site fidelity now that the foraging habitat is gone?
Yeah, that's a great question. Hopefully it's not too podcasted here. So they will still be in that same inlet. They do tend to use inlet complexes. So say for example, they had their favorite foraging spot had been on Seabrook, and when they came back, habitat had changed. Maybe some winds and storms and things kind of filled it in with sand. And there's another feature that showed up over on Kiowa, then they'd be over on the Kiowa side. So we have seen where we're seeing a little bit more movements, but it's within that same inlet complex. They're not moving to the next complex over. So they have, which Maina did an amazing job as well, is just kind of driving that home, is that it worked for them for quite a while, but now as things change, and these birds have also not evolved to recognize the disturbance factor that keeps them from using some of these habitats. So when they're initially selecting habitat, which I wish I knew how they did that, I'm sure there's a lot of different things that they're keying in on as well as other birds using it. They are not prepared for that, and so that's kind of the double whammy for them. When they're there, it changes, it's not as great, and then you also add the disturbance on, it's going to be much more of a problem.
Thank you. All right, Janet, this next one's for you. So you talked to us about the wide variety of species that we may see on Captain Sams. This question gets at the ways that different species may interact with each other. So can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen different species do with each other? So are they competing? Are they perhaps helping each other? Or are they very indifferent to having just maybe dumplings and dowishers together? Or how is that different birds interacting together?
Yeah, I guess the best way to kind of describe it is everybody's friends at high tide. They all kind of snuggle up together. They all get out of the wind and they kind of use the same wind breaks. So everybody just kind of, when they're sleeping, they're all friends, really packed in together. And it's kind of wild because flocks of dunlin and some pollinated plovers really blend in great with the rack. If you didn't know it, you wouldn't know that they were there because they look so similar to the surroundings. And then when the tide drops, the piping plovers really have their spots, and they don't let anybody else in. Melissa mentioned the black belly clovers, the bigger plovers, they watch the piping plovers and eat those big worms come in, and so they're very competitive when they're feeding. At least piping plovers are. But the cool thing, about shorebirds, like Melissa mentioned, there's the gleaners, the shorter billed birds that kind of pick off the top insects looking for the worms and looking for them. And then, the other birds that are provers. So there's kind of room for everything to feed. And the cool thing is you don't see that everywhere. It's just amazing to see on these two islands. There's so many birds doing so many different things, finding what they need. And that's just kind of the remarkable thing to me.
I love that the piping plover is the tiniest bird, but it's the feistiest. All right, Abby, these next few ones are for you. I think U5 is a popular bird around here, so.
questions coming up about oystercatchers. So, this first one, when banding young oystercatchers, are records kept of the parents, such as U5?
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about that.
Yes, the records of the adults that are banded are kept. If the adults are unbanded, that's noted as well. And so it is possible to get family trees of oystercatchers, which is pretty darn cool.
Okay, that leads into this next question. How many generations are known? And I know it depends on the species, but do you know of different generations of shorebirds? Since American oystercatchers are such long-lived, do we have records of multiple generations at one site or throughout?
I mean, I'm certain, I just haven't dug into the database enough. Have any of you? I know that I know of many instances in Georgia where I have favorite banded birds that have chicks, and their chicks have survived, or we see their chicks in weird spots, but tragically, off the top of my head, I don't have any cool family stories. Do you?
I think probably North Carolina, because they banned everything up there.
North Carolina bans a lot. So every state gets its own color. There is banding going on across the whole Atlantic coast. You can look at the American Oystercatcher Working Group website to learn more. You can sign up to report any of the bans that you see to the Working Group database, and then you can search the database and discover for yourselves.
One of the really cool things for me was a couple years ago, I was banding some chicks on Botany Bay for a study that I was doing, and one of those chicks, EM, is on your beach now. And that bird, I think I banded it in 2016, and so now it's a breeding adult, and we haven't found a nest yet, but it's just really cool to see kind of, a hatchier bird that I banded come back and didn't stay in Botany Bay, came over here. So it's just really neat to kind of dig in. Once you kind of know the history of a bird, you can really tell its story. And because oystercatchers are so long-lived, it's a long story, and it's pretty neat.
And maybe one other cool thing I think is just when we talk so much about stewardship, having banded birds that have those individual recognizable marks, like those bands, then we can connect with them and share their stories. And you get somebody who maybe doesn't know too much about birds, but they are dedicated to their favorite buddies. And so it's awesome. It's a good conservation tool because it helps us understand what places are important and all sorts of really important demographic information, but it's also a really good education and outreach tool.
Thank you. Still on the topic of oystercatchers. So, we know they're long-lived. How long does it take for an oystercatcher to be a breeding adult? And how many years does it take for it to lose the black tip on their beak?
3 years? 3 years. I mean, I shouldn't be the only one answering these questions. Jen knows oystercatchers, everybody loves and knows them.
Yeah, I think 3 years is when they become able to breed. A lot of times they're not successful, in their first attempt, but they have a kind of a golden eye. They don't get that bright orange eye until 3 years. 3 years? Yeah. So they go through kind of different stages. So you can kind of tell a young of the year bird versus an adult from their eye color, and the orange bit is an adult color bill.
So often in the breeding season, there'll be little bands of teenage young birds that are not breeding but run around and harass all of the breeding pairs. So keep your eyes out because it's kind of gross.
All right, I think we're getting short on time, so let's do one more question. And this one gets at, unfortunately, the threats that they're facing. So we talked about hiding clovers, which are federally listed. We talked about red knots last night, which are also federally listed. This is for any of you, but are there any other species that are likely to be also included on the federally listed species that you can see due to ongoing threats?
can say that as of right now, we don't, there aren't any shorebird species that have been petitioned to be listed, which is the process that it has to go through for them to become federally listed. But the beauty of the Atlantic Flyway Shorebird Initiative and also the Oystercatcher Working Group and the Wilson's Clover kind of informal working group is that there's a lot of work going on throughout their range to prevent that, hopefully, and through stewardship efforts, that's really going to be one of the biggest ways, because we can't control what's going to happen with sea level rise and climate change and habitat changes, but we can, try to manage really important habitats for them, just to at least lessen that threat than the ones that are coming at us that are still unforeseen, and how they're going to adjust, we're not quite sure. So there is nothing that has currently been petitioned, but many of them are in decline, but there are a lot of great initiatives out there that are trying to prevent them from. And honestly, they don't need to be listed for somebody to be working on them. All shorebirds definitely need help. So anything you can do, just even spreading their story with your friends and family, wherever they are, would be greatly appreciated.